If you've been following along with me in this chapter, you're comfortable now creating multiple pages within a single CorelDRAW file. You also know exactly how to create different page layouts for those different pages in CorelDRAW. So now it's time to talk about one more feature before we start creating, and that is guidelines as well as snap to options, because guidelines are really going to help you when it comes to lining up the objects you create or insert into your file. Now, you may have noticed from the very beginning when we started using this file, which is based on a template, that there are certain lines showing up on the left-hand side at the top and the bottom all the way down the left. Same thing across the top and across the bottom, the right-hand side. These are called guidelines. And these guidelines are actually set at the top, bottom, left, and right-hand side of the page to make sure that everything stays inside those boundaries. Well, the first thing I want to show you is that from the View menu, you can choose whether or not you're going to view those guidelines or not. Guidelines are typically turned on by default. You see a check mark here. If I click on Guidelines, I don't see those lines anymore. Now they're still there, they're just invisible. If I go back up to View, down to Guidelines, I toggle it back on, and there's the guidelines there. So how did they get there? Well, I'm glad you asked. We're going to go down to page 2 of this document. If you're following along with me, you're still working with our bistro sign here. If you've jumped to this lesson though, and you want to get all caught up, no problem. If you've got the exercise files, go to the Lesson 2 folder and open up bistro sign 4.cdr. You'll have exactly what I have. And when we come down here to the second tab, now labeled Menu, and click on it, there's our new blank page that we created in a previous lesson. The page layout was changed to an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. And typically, when you have a blank page like this, you're ready to start creating, adding content, creating content. And when you do that, if you need things to line up perfectly, guidelines can really help. So how do we get those guidelines in there? We go to the rulers on the left and across the top of your screen to add guidelines. When you add a guideline from the top ruler, you're going to get a horizontal guideline. So let's click and drag just from anywhere on the ruler down to about the 10.5 inch mark. I'm going to go right there and release. I now have a new guideline, and this will help me when lining things up and not going too far above that border when I start adding objects. Let's add another one to the bottom. So again, we go up to this top ruler, click and drag all the way down to the 1/2 inch mark. And I'm going to let go, just not in the right place here. And if that ever happens, no problem. Just go back to it. When you see the double arrow, you can click and drag to move it. And move it right to the 1/2 inch mark and let go. And I'm just looking over here on the ruler to make sure I'm right at the 1/2 inch mark. Now we can also add some vertical guidelines by going to our ruler on the left. Same thing. Now I want my menu items to go down the center. So I'm going to go over here to the 2 inch mark. And when I get right on the 2 inch mark, I'll let go. Notice how it turns red. It's currently selected. We can go to any of these guidelines, and when we click on them, they appear red to indicate they're selected. Just click anywhere on your page and none of them turn red. Let's add one more now. We're going to go over here to the 6.5 inch mark. Go right there. That's 2 inches off the right hand side of my 8.5 inch piece of paper. And now I've got this little area. I've got it all cordoned off, ready to start adding my menu items, my objects. That's exactly what we're going to be doing in the next lesson. But just before we do that, another cool feature to make sure that things always stay lined up on those guidelines is the snap to function. Now when you're creating objects and you want them lined up, say side by side, when you move one object close to another one, by default, it's going to look like there's a little magnet between the two and they'll just snap together. That's called snap to objects. Well, when we choose snap to guidelines, we get that same effect. And notice up here in the toolbar, there's a snap to drop down. And when I click on it, I've got snap to grid. Now, if you want to display your grid, it's kind of like graph paper. You can have objects snapping to the grid, not typically turned on by default. Keyboard shortcut, Control-Y. Snap to guidelines is currently not turned on, and that's the one I do want to turn on. So clicking snap to guidelines turns it on. When I go back to the snap to, it has a check mark next to it. Snap to objects already had a check mark. Alt-Z is the keyboard shortcut for turning that on and off. It's a toggle. Each time you hold down Alt and press the letter Z, you'll be turning it on and off, on and off. There's also something called dynamic guides that can be snapped to as well, but we're going to focus in on these two for now, snap to guidelines and snap to objects. So with those selected, I click down here and I'm now ready to start adding those objects. I just want to show you something here. If we go up to the View menu, you'll notice that all of those options also appear down here. There's my guidelines, and down below there's Snap to Grid, Guidelines, Objects, and Dynamic Guides. If I click on any one of these guidelines to select it, I also see some different options on my property bar. Notice that this button here is depressed. It looks like it's pushed in. It's the Snap to Guidelines feature, so I can turn it off and back on right from there as well. And I've got the preset guidelines that can be turned on and off, and when I click on it, the options dialog shows up, Corel presets. I can have 1-inch margins, the bleed area, page borders. All of these are presets that I can choose to turn on or off just by selecting the checkbox. So I'm going to go to my page borders and click OK. You can see I've also got guidelines now. The page border shows up all the way around the outside here. So I've got all the guidelines I need. What happens when you don't want a guideline? Let's add one more. I'm going to click and drag from my left ruler right to over here about the 5-inch mark, and I'm going to drag another one to the 4 1/4 inch mark, which is the center of an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. So I've got this one extra one in here. To delete it, just click on it. You know it's selected when it turns red. Hit your delete key on the keyboard and it's gone. Simple as that. So I think that's all I need for guidelines. If you're going to be following along in the next chapter, we're going to be using this file. You might want to save your changes. I will have a new version of this file in the next chapter as well. So let's move on now to actually creating here in CorelDRAW by creating your own objects.